Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second of the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences guest lecture series for 2020 to 2021. Hopefully, you've managed to navigate the links correctly. I've only had a couple of emails asking for passwords, so if you've made it into the room, well done. If you're watching via the YouTube channel, then hopefully that has been an easier navigation for you this evening. So thank you for joining us. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Michael Strategos from SWERC, the Scottish University's Environmental Research Centre. Michael studied for his undergraduate at Aberdeen in Scotland before moving to Southampton to complete a master's, before returning back to Scotland after PhD research and again working at SWERC. So I'm going to pass over to Michael now, and very much looking forward to the lecture. If you have any questions which come up, please do feel free to drop those into the Q&A button, which you can see on your screen at the bottom, and we'll ask those at the end of the lecture. But I'm going to pass over to Michael. I'll put myself on mute and on video mute, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate the invitation to come speak to you tonight. And I suppose the first thing to say is that this is the culmination of the past 3 years of research on the Living on Water project, which is funded by Historic Environment Scotland and carried out via SWERC, where myself, Peter Jacobson, Derek Hamilton, and Gordon Cook are based. And although I'm speaking to you tonight, it's very much a team effort, and so I'm just the mouthpiece, and everybody has contributed more or less equally, really, to this project over the course of the past 3 years. And the aim, the overarching aim of the project has been to investigate the early Iron Age, the mid-first millennium BC, emergence of crannogs in Loch Tay in central Scotland. If you tried to put a pin in the middle of Scotland, you'd more or less end up at Loch Tay. So to begin really with sort of first principles, if you don't know what a crannog is, you're looking at one now. They tend to be small rocky islets with some trees on. If they actually break the surface of the loch that they're in, many more are frequently entirely submerged. And there are many hundreds of these across the country. In fact, the latest counts, if you use the most sort of encompassing definition, would put the figure of crannogs somewhere over 600 throughout Scotland. And they have sort of regional flavors. Sort of central and northern mainland, you get these rocky mounds, underneath which tends to be timber and organic material. In the southwest, the middle photo there, they tend to be less impressive to look at, usually because the lochs are a little more eutrophic, and the mounds are lower, and they're primarily organic material that's just dumped onto the loch bed. A slightly different style of construction, perhaps, but equally, or in fact, better preservation. And certainly in drained contexts like that middle photograph, you can actually open up quite significant areas and take a good photograph, which is frequently impossible in very dark loch water in the more northerly examples. As you get to the far north of the mainland, and certainly in the northern and western Isles, the style of construction changes again, and they tend to be these kind of rocky mounds with very little timber or no timber incorporated into their construction. And that's, of course, reflecting just the sort of the wider environment where there are very few trees in northern and western Scotland. And this is what we sort of think they might have looked like. In effect, usually one or a small number of roundhouses. Certainly the sort of northern and central Highland examples were probably built as pile dwellings initially, and then latterly they become more or less rocky islets on top of which sometimes structures are built. In the southwest, as I mentioned, you could maybe sort of imagine more of like a cofferdam as a substructure to create a more solid surface on top of which you get these roundhouse type structures. And of course, in the north and northwest, they're more just sort of dry stone structures. But this is sort of what we think they're looking like, not too far away from effectively a terrestrial timber Iron Age roundhouse, but just set out over water. Sometimes a few tens of meters out from the shore, but in some cases they're over 100 meters from the nearest shore. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest that the Crannog builders were actually seeking out locations as far away from shore as they could reasonably go. So as I mentioned in the title slide, our focus is very much a chronological one, and exploring the early Iron Age, the mid-first millennium BC emergence of Crannogs. If you zoomed back certainly 120 years ago, that would have been a very strange thing to propose at all, because Crannogs were very much from the Roman period onwards. And that is thanks largely due to Robert Monroe, who was a really incredible antiquarian in terms of his archaeological rigor. Much of his work would be acceptable or nearly acceptable today. And he was working in the 1870s and 1880s primarily. And he only had to go on for the chronology of these sites were the odd bit of ceramic, and really the only typologically distinct ceramic from Iron Age Scotland tends to be Roman imports, and in this case, a bit of Samian ware. And that's what led Monroe to suggest that these were predominantly, or indeed only, Roman and post-Roman structures. And that continued right into the middle of the 20th century when Margaret Piggot excavated another Crannog in southwest Scotland at Milton Loch. And she found what was a first or second centuries AD enamel loop there pictured. And so, of course, this sort of confirmed the idea that these sites were Roman or post-Roman in date. And that was the received wisdom until the 1970s, when Margaret Piggot then decided to apply radiocarbon dating to her old excavation at Milton Loch. And all of a sudden, the pre-Roman chronological horizon for Crannogs emerged. Two radiocarbon dates, the only two that she took, both very clearly in the first millennium BC. And so all of a sudden, these Crannogs, which at the time there were several hundred known, thought to be Roman or post-Roman, all of a sudden became Iron Age and pre-Roman Iron Age in some time emerging in the first millennium BC. And since that time, since the 1970s, there has been quite a few Crannogs radiocarbon dated. And typically, the dates come back anywhere from the Iron Age to the post-medieval period, with sort of prevalence towards the prehistoric period, sort of before the middle of the first millennium AD. And the usual method for taking these dates is to get your scuba tank on, drop down onto the side of one of these Crannogs, find an exposed timber, hack a bit off and send it off to the radiocarbon lab. And this is a perfectly fine way to get an idea of the date of the site, but it doesn't do very well in terms of the fact that many of these sites are multi-period, as you can see on the calibrated dates on the right there of the slide. And you're very often dealing with multiple phases of use, which are right in front of you. So they don't, due to the nature of sort of reinserting timbers, you can frequently have many different periods of use confused immediately in front of you. So one timber next to another can frequently be separated by centuries or indeed a millennium or more. You would think that dendrochronology would be the silver bullet to sort of sort all this out and to get very precise felling dates based on ring width measurements of the timbers that are used to construct these sites. But unfortunately, the Crannog dwellers in Scotland tended not to use oak, which is the preferred timber for, certainly for doing dendrochronology that leads to a calendar date. They use alder instead, and you can do dendrochronology on alder, and we'll speak about that in a little bit. but it often, or it never leads to a calendar date. You can only do a relative dendrochronology. When oak is used on crannogs, and you do get a significant portion of oak, it tends to be shorter lived timbers on the order of 50 to 100 years. And these are not typically suitable for really robust calendar dates and matching to the master chronologies that you would need to lead to a calendar date. So we really are very much reliant on radiocarbon dating. And looking at a site, you might sort of eyeball that you've got maybe 3 or 4 different phases. But the problem with this is that the radiocarbon calibration curve can mask what is a lot of different phasing even within that one radiocarbon date. So for instance, the group of 3 at the bottom that date to the mid-first millennium BC, you could be looking at a single event, never mind a single phase of use there. Or you could be looking at 3 different events separated by a century or more apiece. And this is particularly problematic in that mid-first millennium BC and that what's known as the Hallstatt Plateau, which I'll speak about more in a moment. And this is just an illustration of that over the Hallstatt Plateau. You have your measurement on the left there, and it catches this very flat part of the calibration curve. And now you can't, the probabilities there are meaningful, but really at the end of the day, you really are looking at the full range there. So the date of the event that of your sample is equally or very nearly equally likely to be anywhere between 750 and 430 cal BC in this case. And anytime you clip the plateau with your radiocarbon measurement, you bring in really quite a large part of the plateau. And as I said, there's not really much that you can do to sort of see within that on the basis of just one or a handful of dates. And such was the case at Loch Tay. So Nick Dixon, beginning in 1979 and continuing through this project, spent a lot of time diving around the different crannogs and taking samples, and got a huge number of early Iron Age, mid-first millennium BC dates, which you can see on the left there. And if you can't see because it's too small, that's just fine, because as I said, trying to make heads or tails of it is really a bit of a fool's errand. Essentially what you're looking at is a series of one-off events that could fall really anywhere between 800 and 400 BC. Now, Nick and Barry focus most of their work at Oakbank Crannog, which is located towards the east end of Loch Tay. Nick began excavating in 1980, and over the course of really the last 40 years has been excavating off and on. Now, the dating of Oakbank is a little bit better because the scale of the excavation allowed Nick to develop a bit of a sense of the site stratigraphy, and that can put some phasing into the sequence of events, the sequence of construction events and occupation events at the site. But at the end of the day, the site's absolute chronology still relies on these radiocarbon dates, and we're still in the same situation. These one-off radiocarbon dates don't really amount to anything more than saying that, yes, that timber or that plant macrofossil died sometime between 800 and 400 BC. In addition to the radiocarbon dates, there is some more relative chronology that I mentioned. Obviously, there's the stratigraphy, but Anne Crone, who has been involved with the Living on Water project, actually did her PhD research back in the 1980s on material from Oakbank, and we've been reusing that extensively. And she was able to use older dendrochronologies to develop a sense of sort of a sequence of events. But given that she was only dealing with a relatively small number of samples across the site at the time, and the trickiness of doing older dendrochronology, and it is very, very tricky. Essentially, the result is that what we're looking at is major construction events punctuated by a series of repairs is sort of what Anne's PhD could conclude, and not a whole lot more. And that's due to the nature of that alder dendrochronology, which is just very difficult to get to work. And that has to do with the way alder grows more than anything else. Further relative chronologies that we've tried to build into our work, again, was another PhD student, Rob Sands, who did tool mark signature analysis. That's how well preserved many of these timbers are, that you can actually see the sort of the small imperfections in the axe blade. And Rob Sands took photographs of these and essentially lined them up using some computer software, some 1990s computer software, and was able to group timbers based on which axe cut which timber. And so that sort of grouped them in time by the fact that you would assume that the axe was the same across these multiple timbers. And so we've been using this relative information in our chronology building for Oakbank. About 10 years ago, a step forward was made with the application of wiggle match dating. And this has become the central feature of our Living on Water project. But 10 years ago, led by Gordon Cook, one timber from Oakbank was sampled sequentially through its growth rings. And those different groups of rings were then dated. And that led to an estimation for the felling of that one timber right around 500 Cal BC. And this was the first time that wiggle match dating had been applied to a crannog in Scotland. And it was at the time before even the first successful dendrochronology, absolute dendrochronology dates that had been achieved from a crannog in Scotland in the southwest, again by Anne Crone. So this was a real move forward, but it was limited by the fact that it's a single timber on a single site. That tells you that, yes, it was felled around 500, but it doesn't really allow for much more to be said other than that a single timber was felled around 500. A much more encompassing approach was going to be needed to be able to place the site and its sequence of construction into a broader archaeological narrative. So I mentioned wiggle match dating. How that works is to cut up a known sequence, in this case, the annual rings of a tree. And if you radiocarbon date any of these groups, I've illustrated here 5 rings because that's what we've primarily done for the Living on Water project. If you date any of these groups of rings, you know the time interval between them. And that sort of gives you a bit of a statistical framework on which to hang your radiocarbon measurements. And so it looks something like this. The black box and whiskers are your radiocarbon measurements. The green is the radiocarbon calibration curve. And essentially, the Oxcal software or whatever software you'd like to use is just trying to find a best fit for those radiocarbon measurements to the radiocarbon calibration curve. And doing this, you can sort of estimate, in some cases very precisely, the felling date of these timbers, or the last ring that you have surviving on the timber. And it was this broad approach that Pete Jacobsen took for his PhD research, investigating crannogs primarily in the Clyde. And the real breakthrough with what Pete was doing under the supervision of Gordon Cook and Derek Hamilton was to essentially be able to use this finer chronology to place crannogs really for the first time into an archaeological narrative that had any kind of more genuine meaning by sort of placing precisely when these sites were constructed into a broader context. So in the case of Erskine and Dumbuck, these intertidal crannogs, they weren't in use at the same time, and they don't seem to be related to other historical events, either in what is understood about Iron Age settlement in that part of Scotland, which is what the 200 BC event is referring to there, or indeed Roman activity in the area. From the Antonine Wall or the various Roman campaigns in central and northern Scotland. So it was this general approach that we were going to apply to Loch Tay, but this time for the first millennium BC, that very problematic period of the radiocarbon calibration curve. And it was the case that there's about half of the 18 Crannogs in Loch Tay have rangefinder dates to this mid-first millennium BC period. And it seems on the face of it that this is the primary settlement type for that period. There's very little to suggest that there's really any other mid-first millennium BC settlement, or at least it doesn't survive. And we've looked at that since, and I'll come on to that later. And it is also the case that Oakbank remains the only extensively excavated Crannog in Loch Tay. So it really was kind of the anchor point around which the Living on Water project has turned, using the not inconsiderable assemblage from Oakbank to sort of bulk out our picture of what life on early Iron Age Crannogs was like. And so beginning in 2017 and continuing until last year, we went out to Loch Tay each summer and opened a series of trenches across 6 of the previously unexcavated Crannogs, plus going back to Oakbank to sample further timbers. Through the course of the project, we had identified over 300 different timber elements and sampled over half of those. Anne Crone looked at virtually all of the sampled timbers and did dendrochronology on them and developed both intrasite floating chronologies and intersite floating chronologies. So in a couple of cases with some oak timbers, we were actually able to create matches from a timber from one site to a different site. And that was a real breakthrough in being able to pin down the contemporaneity of the sites across the loch. Of those floating dendrochronologies, we have about, I think it's now actually 18 wiggle match dates. And that, when we date the floating dendrochronologies, that dates over 75 timbers across the sites, which relate to these construction events on the Crannogs. The earliest evidence we have dates to the first half of the 6th century BC. But the majority of activity is really from the 5th century, and right around 400 Cal BC, there seems to be something of a change where there is a bit of a burst of Crannog building activity, and that kind of tails off, but then there's continued activity through later centuries of the first millennium BC. At Oakbank, like I mentioned, we went back and resampled. I wouldn't say excavated. Nick, from 1980 onwards, had done a pretty good job of that already. So it's really just a case of removing those sandbags that you can see in that photo there, and finding the dynamo tag labels that have been stuck onto the timbers, and taking the ones we wanted, and off we went. But at the other sites, it was very much a case of effectively excavating them from fresh. They hadn't been touched really before, other than Nick taking the odd sample or two in previous years. And this is a very typical look at what a Crannog looks like underwater after you've removed that upper layer of stones. You come down onto sort of sands and gravels that are interleaved with spreads of organic debris. This organic debris, if you're really quick with the camera, you can actually catch it. Still has some of that its green or tawny color, as if it was really just sort of last year's bedding. These spreads of organic debris sit within a range of timbers. And like I mentioned before, as you're excavating these sites and you're looking at it, you really can have zero sense and certainly no certainty over the date of these timbers. It's essentially just a jumble, a mass of timber. Whatever falls into the loch and hits the loch bed essentially is preserved. So you're looking at this and we just try and do our best to take what samples we can that we think will produce the best results. And this is what many timbers look like freshly cut. This is an oak timber, and oak heartwood has a chemical reaction that creates that very dark black color. But the rest of the timber there has a very fresh looking quality to it. In fact, even if you put your nose to that, it even smells like fresh wood that's been cut. But that particular timber, I can now tell you with certainty, is about 2,500 years old. So in that, in those organic debris layers is an incredible amount of information preserved in the form of ecofactual material. And Jen Miller has been looking at this at the University of Nottingham-Trent. And essentially what the results are suggesting is that, at least for the early Iron Age, for the context that we're confident date to that mid-first millennium BC, the over sort of arching story is that the entire landscape is being used. Right from the Loch shore, which sits at about 100 meters above sea level, to the tops of the surrounding mountains. Ben Lawes sits on the north side of Loch Tay, and that reaches close to 1,000 meters above sea level. And so the entire landscape seems to be being used, and that material is ending up in the on the Crannogs, and the evidence in particular that's pointed to indicate that people, or indeed or their animals perhaps more likely, are going up into these high alpine areas is cloudberry, that last species listed there, and cloudberry only grows in this area above 300 to 500 meters above sea level. So certainly up into the hills, people or their animals are going, and they're bringing that material in the form of pips back to the Crannog. And in this particular list of species, it's worth pointing out that it comes from just 1.5 liters a sample, just to highlight again how incredible the preservation conditions are on these sites. Although preservation on Crannogs is generally incredibly good, there are a handful of instances where it was not so good. And in this case at Fearnan Hotel, and this is sort of emblematic of a more general pattern, is that we had later first millennium AD reoccupation of many of these sites. And where that was the case, it was really quite catastrophic. To put it mildly, to many of the early Iron Age contexts. And it seems in the case at Fearnan Hotel and another at Milton Mornish that essentially what was happening was a large amount of stone material was brought to site and laid down on the top of the Iron Age horizons. For what reason remains slightly unclear. One possibility is that they're simply trying to raise the level of the site up to build whatever superstructure they're attempting to. Another possibility is that there's a substantially stone superstructure on top of whatever's being holding that up, and this is obviously then collapsed. And so we're looking at over a meter of quite large stones that cap the early Iron Age horizon in this case, right down at the bottom there. And this is also the reason why you're looking at a drawing instead of a photograph, because there was so much suspended sediment in the water column that all the photographs from that particular trench don't show a whole lot. It was very difficult working on that, I can assure you. So the chronological results, I showed you this a bit earlier in quite a small fashion. Here it is a little bit larger, this kind of unorganized mess really of radiocarbon dates. We could be looking at all of these sites in use at the same time, a hive of activity on the Loch, or you could be looking at a series of sites that are separated in time by decades and indeed centuries. And the people that lived and built on them may not have even known each other. Our results show that, well, actually, indeed, there are Crannogs in contemporary occupation. We have this very well pinned down for right around 400. And that is in part due to just what we sampled. Seems to be that there's more activity going on at 400, so we encountered that more often. And it also has to do with the sharpness of the calibration curve. Right at that 400 BC period, we're coming off the Hallstatt Plateau, and that allows our precision to increase and get very precise dates so that we can really confidently say, yes, these sites and those trees were felled at the same time. Through the 5th century BC, though, 5th century BC, there is activity leading up to that 400 pulse, and some hints that there might be earlier activity across the loch at the different sites. And so, for the first time, really, we can begin to populate a group of Crannogs in the 1st millennium BC across Loch Tay and indeed across Scotland. We are looking at different sites in occupation at the same time. Now, this is very far from a village. These sites are separated by at least a couple hundred meters. The closest ones are located about 50 meters apart from each other. But what we can say is that there is a loch dwelling community here. This isn't just a one-off oddity for one group or one family, but there is actually a sort of a community, a network, if you will, of these sites across the loch. And sort of to show this through time, if you will, we have the earliest dates come from Dalbay South, located more or less midway along the loch on the south shore. And there's some indication that there's perhaps construction activity around the first half of the 6th century BC. This is then followed by activity indicated at 5 of the 7 sites that we looked at in the 5th century BC. All 5 of those sites in red have at least some activity, some construction activity dated to somewhere in the 5th century BC. This is then followed by a spike in activity, really, between 400 and 350 Cal BC, where at 4 of these sites, we have evidence for really quite substantial reworking of whatever was there, as well as any potential continued activity going on at Fearnan Hotel, which only has that 5th century BC date indicated so far. So what exactly does this mean? Well, one of the things that we need to do is look at the wider context. And I mentioned before that there's really no visible settlement that dates to the mid-1st millennium BC around Loch Tay. And this isn't for want of trying. There is a very robust and rich archaeological record around Loch Tay. But there's only a handful of sites that you could even broadly consider as kind of later prehistoric, which is now on your screen. And of those, only a handful have actually been looked at. Most of them would more typically date to either earlier or later periods. They aren't very sort of distinctive of being mid-1st millennium BC, other than the Crannogs, of course. And of those, only a handful have actually seen excavation. The 2 of those, Tom Breck and Croft Vellick, which are labeled there, were excavated as part of the Ben Lawes Historic Landscape Project. Now, that project was done in the early 2000s and ostensibly was looking at medieval settlement and post-medieval settlement. But they did look at a couple Iron Age sites, Tom Breck and Croft Vellick, and the dating from those would seem to indicate not quite mid-1st millennium BC, but slightly later, from kind of that 400 to 200 BC period. The other 2 sites labeled there, Eastercroft and Teigen and Ardnagal, were excavated by ourselves through support from the Royal Archaeological Institute. Those are the dates from Croft Vellick and Tom Breck, by the way, as you can see, sort of certainly after the 5th century BC, and very reasonably sometime after that pulse of Crannog building at 400 to 350 BC, although there is some possibility that if you read those radiocarbon dates as dating to the earliest part of that period, earliest part of their calibrated ranges could possibly be contemporary with that 400 to 350 pulse of Crannog building. So we looked at Eastercroft and Teigen and Ardnagal, and we were able to excavate reasonable sized areas of these typically Iron Age type sites, ring-ditched house in the case of Eastercroft and Teigen. Reasonable preservation for northern Scotland, which is typically really generally very poor preservation. A series of post holes in a classic ring ditch formation, which we have now radiocarbon dated thanks to an NEIF grant for radiocarbon dates. And everything from Crofton-Teigen seems to relate to the turn of the first millennium AD, possibly a little bit earlier. Certainly nowhere near that 400 to 350 Cal BC pulse of Crannog building activity. Further west at Ardnagall, similar typical Iron Age site type, a hut circle, but in this case, very poorly preserved. It had been really mucked around with by post-medieval settlement, even quite recent cattle grazing. But we were able to find in situ preserved Iron Age contexts. Once again, we're looking at a timber post roundhouse, just in a slightly different configuration to a ring ditch house. And the dating we got, in addition to the old dates, once again, looking like quite a bit later than that 400 to 350 Cal BC pulse, maybe at a stretch, possibly contemporary with it in a couple of contexts. But in all likelihood, it's looking like all the terrestrial settlement dates quite a bit later than the pulse of Crannog building. So what does that leave us then in terms of understanding the wider landscape and indeed the society of these Crannog dwellers? Well, as I mentioned, we're looking at terrestrial settlement, as far as we can tell and as far as we can find, dates to sometime after that early Iron Age emergence and pulse of Crannog building through the 5th century BC, and then right around 400 to 350 Cal BC, where we get a lot of construction activity. There doesn't seem to be a terrestrial component to that settlement landscape. So we are in fact looking at a landscape that is dominated by Crannogs in the mid-1st millennium BC. And this is striking for several reasons. One, because I think the assumption has always been that Crannogs form part of a settlement network rather than being the main focus or indeed the only settlement in the landscape. But at Loch Tay, at this time in the mid-1st millennium BC, that doesn't seem to be the case. And this is much more reminiscent of arguments that have been made for understanding Atlantic Scotland. And most recently, Niall Sharples writes about house societies in Atlantic Scotland, talking about brocks, of course. But I think, given the evidence, at least in the mid-1st millennium BC, we might be able to apply that type of concept at Loch Tay. If there is terrestrial settlement contemporary with that mid-1st millennium BC Crannog building, we can't see it. So that would suggest to me, and we do see obviously that later terrestrial settlement. So that would suggest to me that if Crannogs aren't the only settlement along the loch, they are clearly the predominant and sort of central focus, as Niall Sharple writes there, for settlement at that time in Loch Tay. And this points to a wider issue about regionality in Iron Age Scotland. The understanding of Iron Age Scotland is through this almost hyper-regional lens, that different areas have shared cultural identities based predominantly on the settlement pattern and the different types of settlement that are used in the north and west, dry stone architecture, in the south and east, timber roundhouses. But the evidence from Loch Tay that we have these perhaps house societies based around Crannogs would seem to point to a slightly more wider shared cultural identity that sort of centers around the house in this way. And I think a really good illustration of that is actually the fact that in the north and west, you do get these Crannogs, but they are equally brocks as well, with the very classic brock dry stone architecture set on top of artificial islands. So I think one of the things that's come out of the Living on Water project has been to make the edges of the intensely regional understanding of the Scottish Iron Age as relating to these different groups of settlement types has become much more fuzzy. And I'll reiterate that in a moment. But I think one of the key things moving forward is to test. We've got 5th century at Loch Tay. We've got 5th century BC in the southwest of Scotland now, thanks to the work of Anne Crone and Graham Cavers. And so I think what we need to do is roll out the living on water methodology, or adapting it to these different contexts to test, are we looking at a 5th century BC emergence of artificial island dwelling, Crannog dwelling in Shetland, the Western Isles, northern Scotland, far northern Scotland. This is an obvious next step to understand, what exactly the nature of artificial island dwelling means, Crannog dwelling means, and goes further to this idea of sort of intensely regional identities, because I would suggest, if it is the case that everybody starts building artificial islands on which to live all at the same time, that would point to not an intensely regional society across all of Scotland, but in fact one that has widely shared cultural understanding of what it means to live in a house on water. And to sort of further illustrate that, we actually have evidence, at least in Loch Tay and from southwest Scotland, of not only going and building your house on water, but doing virtually the same thing. In this case, depositing a wooden agricultural implement in the floor layers of the Crannog house. Both at Oakbank and Coltsloch, there are examples of ards or plowshares that have been recovered from these types of contexts. And indeed, there's a third example from Milton Loch that Margaret Piggot excavated back in the 1950s. And that's on display in the National Museum of Scotland if you ever get a chance to wander around there. The key thing about Oakbank and Coltsloch, though, is that based on the dating that we've done at Oakbank and the dating that Anne Crone has done at Coltsloch, we can say that these two sites are in use probably in the same decade, at the very end of the 6th century BC. So the fact that they're essentially doing the same thing at the same place, separated by hundreds of kilometers, I think points to a very connected community that has at least a shared sense of what it means and what to do on your house on water. And so to sort of summarize implications for the wider Scottish Iron Age, the Living on Water project has developed a new method for developing chronochronologies that cuts through those issues of the Hallstatt Plateau and the uncertainty of radiocarbon calibration. It can do so without having to excavate massive areas of the site, which is obviously cost prohibitive, and certainly under present circumstances is just simply not possible. And these chronologies allow a way into exploring both site development, which I haven't dwelt on too much, and understanding a sense of social history, which I've tried to emphasize tonight. It is the case that early Iron Age Crannogs, mid-first millennium BC Crannogs, are in use at the same time on Loch Tay. That has been demonstrated conclusively now, and that's very exciting. This is the first time that a group of Crannogs can be shown to be in use at precisely the same time. It seems to be the case that Crannogs are at least a main settlement focus in the early Iron Age, rather than perhaps part of a diverse settlement pattern at this time. As you move into the later centuries of the first millennium BC, that diverse settlement pattern seems to perhaps emerge. With the construction of ring ditch houses and hut circle houses across the Loch. I don't wish to sort of remove the idea that regionality doesn't exist in the Scottish Iron Age. It certainly does. But I think Crannogs and the practice of building these artificial islands to live on and do particular things on shows very strong ties, and in particular cases, ties together these different regions with the same practice. And so once again, we're going to need to build further chronologies in order to continue to test that idea that people are building and using these sites in similar or the same ways across space. And that is going to require finer and finer chronologies at more and more Crannog sites. And just as sort of something to chew on as well is what's going on 800 to 600 BC. You would be very hard pressed to find any site in Scotland that you can very confidently, without a shadow of a doubt, say it dates to 800 to 600 BC. There's a handful of artifacts. There's very little settlement that tend to be based on, in this archaeologist's opinion, slightly ropey artifact typologies. There's an odd archaeomagnetic date, and there are of course loads of 800 to 400 Cal BC radiocarbon dates. But as the Living on Water project has shown, there is nothing to say that those dates don't all date to after 600, and that they are in fact relating to events that took place between 600 and 400 BC because of those problems with the Hallstatt Plateau calibration, part of the calibration curve. And so it is a genuine mystery to me what is going on 800 to 600 BC, and that casts into stark relief then what is moving people to then build Crannogs. If we have virtually no settlement across the entire country, the northern half of Britain really, and then the first thing people do that, at least in Loch Tay, is very obviously visible, is to build an island to live on. It's a strange thing to do, really, and it's even stranger in that context. So one of the key things moving forward, I think, for Scottish archaeology in general is to actually start to try and pin down what is going on 800 to 600 BC. So with that, it leaves me just to thank our funders, Historic Environment Scotland, the Royal Archaeological Institute, the NEIF for the radiocarbon dates for the terrestrial sites, and of course our project partners. I'm just the mouthpiece tonight, and I must thank my my colleagues and collaborators: Anne Crone, Jen Miller, Nick Dixon, Barry Andrian, and of course my close colleagues at Zurich, Pete Jacobson, Derek Hamilton, and Gordon Cook. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Michael, for that fascinating introduction to a very enigmatic form of settlement in Scotland in a very interesting time period, as you mentioned there. So I'm sure that everybody would join me in a virtual round of applause. I've got some comments coming in saying very appreciative comments of the lecture, so thank you for that. If anyone does have any questions, please do feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. I've got a couple in there already from Mia, which we'll come to in a second, and I'll ask Mia to unmute and ask those questions in a moment. I've got a couple of potentially obvious questions. So at the end, you asked what's going on between 800 and 600 BC, but for me, what stands out is what's going on at 400 to make people start this Crannog explosion as such. Why are they suddenly utilizing Crannogs around 400 BC, and what does that say about the wider environment? Because obviously, expanding from that, how many people would be living on a Crannog, do you think? How big a society would be on an individual Crannog? Why 400 BC? How many people in the area? And do you think it's related to a depopulation almost if they're condensing down onto a few number of Crannogs?
I'll answer the question about the number of people on a Crannog at once. We don't know, is the first thing to say. There have been plenty of estimations. The number of Crannogs that actually have a full ground plan are very few to begin with. But I think at Oakbank, you could be looking comfortably maybe 15, maybe 20 people. You know, it's a big roundhouse. It's a big The reconstruction that was ostensibly based off of Oakbank is something like 15 meters diameter. So they're comparable to big terrestrial roundhouses. So I think you can pretty unproblematically or fairly unproblematically transpose the estimations for the number of people that you could fit into one of those onto a crannog. So if crannogs are the only settlement or the main focus of settlement across the loch at that time, we're not talking about a very populated landscape. We're talking, in the hundreds of people, probably not the thousands. Of course, if there is some type of settlement that we're simply not seeing, there could be many, many more people. But what seems to be happening more widely at 400 isn't a depopulation leading to condensed settlement, but actually an expansion of population. 400 BC is when you get the unequivocal evidence for hill forts across not only Scotland, but also in Wessex. You get a real explosion of the complexity of hill forts, and this has been linked to the idea of increasing population among other ideas. And so perhaps similar things are going on at Loch Tay, that there's actually an increase in the number of people and the amount of activity going on. And that could follow on the back of some amount of depopulation. There's certainly for a long time been the sense that around 800 there is climatic deterioration. And while Loch Tay isn't super upland or highly marginal, if you make the climate a little bit rougher in the past, it could be a bit of a struggle to rely on harvests year in and year out. And there is pretty strong evidence to suggest that the Crannog dwellers are pretty heavily pastoral. They are growing cereal grains, but there's plenty of animal rains as well. So I hope that sort of answered your question. But I'd say the general trend is that if there is depopulation, that's what is happening 600 to 800 BC. And that would explain to a certain degree why we're not seeing much or anything at all. And then it certainly more widely, there's an increase in population or at least an increase in visible activity across Scotland and across Britain around 400. And that is, and as part of that includes an expansion of the Crannog building tradition.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got another question which I might come back to in a few minutes if anyone else doesn't put many more in the question box. We've got a couple coming in though. One which I'm going to ask before me as one. It's a more of a technical one. Comes in from Cappy Batt, who's one head of school in Bradford, and mentions about don't trusting archaeomagnetic dates, which is Cappy's speciality actually. So that's what she does. But she's got a question around the timbers and using the wiggle matching to get around the imprecision of the Hallstatt Plateau. Is there any evidence that the timbers were stored or seasoned before being utilised, which would obviously impact upon the potential construction time period?
So seasoned, I'd say probably not, on the basis that the wooden artifacts, those recovered from Oakbank, but also from Anne Crone and Graham Caver's excavations in Southwest Scotland, the assumption, and I think there's hard evidence for the fact that those are at least being produced from green wood. They're not seasoning artifacts for greenwood. They're not seasoning wood to produce artifacts. And I would have thought the sort of utensils would be what you'd actually want to season. So I think sort of taking a bit of a leap, an interpretive leap there, I would have thought the likelihood is that the timbers are going into the loch green. Now there is a question about reuse. There's certainly the possibility that you come across a crannog from 100 years ago and there's a perfectly good timber lying on the loch bed. Do you reuse it? The answer is very likely yes. With that said, Pete Jacobsen actually looked at this very question in his PhD research, and he found no evidence from the sites he looked at that that was the case. And he did that through Bayesian modeling of his of the couple of wiggle match dates that he got, as well as the other radiocarbon dates that he took from those sites. And his conclusion was that it doesn't seem like there's reuse of timbers. What there certainly is repeated use, sort of a kind of 5 to 10 year cycle of repairs. And we're kind of from the floating dendrochronologies, which I didn't go into in great detail. There is a bit of sense that sort of you get a main construction phase, and then there's a handful of timbers that go in 3 to 5 years later, and then 3 to 5 years later again, and then 3 to 5 years later again after that. And there's kind of this regular upkeep, if you will. And that actually matches quite well with the experience of the reconstruction up at Loch Tay, where they have to do the same thing. Those timbers decay pretty rapidly at the water line every 5 to 10 years or so. So to answer the question very directly, we don't have any evidence, but it's certainly possible that timbers were reused.
Cool, thank you. So I've still got a question from Mia there, which I'm still holding on to, because I've got another technical one which occurred in my mind before we come onto that one. So obviously my background's been in the Alpine area, and one of the reasons proposed by people such as Michel Magny for the lack of lakeshore settlements between sort of 800 and 600 BC is related to the climatic decline which you mentioned around 800 BC, and the fairly functional perspective that the decline caused higher water levels in the lake, which then made the shelves which they would try and settle on be too far below the waterline to make them accessible to utilize. Do you think that's a possibility for Loch Tay, or is the profile different to the Alpine area?
It's I think it's absolutely comparable, and certainly in terms of the sort of very broad model of geomorphology, where you have these kind of relatively steep-sided valleys, and then there's a little flat bit where they're able to build the crannogs. But the problem with that in the Scottish context is twofold. First of all, there is no Bronze Age tradition of crannog building, so it's not like there's an artificial island dwelling tradition that stops and then starts again. So we couldn't actually answer that. The other thing is that there are plenty of broad, shallow lowland lochs where in the Iron Age they're building crannogs. In the early Iron Age they're building crannogs. Certainly all the work in southwest Scotland are on these sort of broad, shallow lochs. And so there's no indication that they're sort of doing it there but unable to do it at Loch Tay. There's long been a question about the level of Loch Tay through the Iron Age. And there's an idea that perhaps actually we're looking at sort of maybe loch side structures rather than proper islands. But I think we've actually shown through the Living on Water project that that's probably not the case. The earliest timber that we have is the highest in terms of altitude, which says to me that essentially the level of the loch can't have ever been lower than that. So everything that dates after that, which is everything, has to have gone into water.
Cool, thank you. So question, there's two from me. I'm going to ask the last one first, and then we'll go from there. So Mia asks if you have any other indications or evidence for a shared sense of community at the time of these crannog constructions. So you talked about the shared sense of living on the water. Are there any other indications beyond crannog constructions of this shared identity that we can see?
So there's the very broad one, which is to build houses round, which is shared, very widely across Britain from the Middle Bronze Age onwards through the Iron Age. So that kind of general sense is there for a very long period, going right back to the Middle Bronze Age. But what has defined Scottish Iron Age archaeology is to then sort of group these different types of roundhouses into different typologies effectively, because there is virtually no artifact assemblage from most Iron Age sites in Scotland. Crannogs are a bit odd in that they have at least something in the form of organic artifacts, but of course these don't survive on dry sites. There is a bit of ceramic, Iron Age ceramic from the Northern and Western Isles, but even here, it's not really early Iron Age. It's certainly after 400 for the most part. So for that mid first millennium BC, there's not a whole lot to go on. There's just these little tiny snippets, maybe the odd bit of metalwork or something else. It's really not until kind of getting on in the first millennium BC that we've got sort of quote unquote Celtic art turning up in different parts of Scotland that seems to point to cultural connections and networks of people moving things around. The middle of the first millennium BC, there's just not a whole lot really, which is one of the reasons why I think it's quite significant that, and could be very significant, in fact, if this sort of tradition of artificial island building and dwelling emerges more or less all at the same time in that kind of 5th century BC horizon.
Brilliant, thank you. And then the last question that we have is back to Oakbank. So how do you think Oakbank compares to the other Crannogs in the area? Obviously it's the most heavily excavated one. Do you think it would be typical for the other Crannogs, or do you think it's a kind of key nodal site, and then the other ones are satellite Crannogs, or how do you think it compares to the wider setting?
Because of the scale of the excavations that we've undertaken elsewhere, it's very difficult to say, but there is one very unique feature about Oakbank, and it is genuinely unique, but it's pure dumb luck that this is the case. And that is that it has essentially an exclusively early Iron Age chronology. Oakbank is essentially the only Crannog in Scotland that has seen substantial excavation that has produced an only early Iron Age, mid first millennium BC chronology. There is nothing that we've dated, and there's nothing that certainly Nick excavated that would suggest or demonstrate that there are phases at that site that postdate certainly 300 and even 350 Cal BC. So what that means is that the contexts at Oakbank are incredibly important because of that which I showed in one of the slides. There hasn't been that reworking of the site. There is just these early Iron Age phases that kind of the initial construction, some periods of repair, perhaps a substantial period of abandonment, but then a major reworking of the site around 400, and that's it. That's all that's the entirety of the chronology at Oakbank. So it is incredibly unique and important for that reason alone. But I stress here, Nick, in deciding to choose Oakbank, chose it for really no other reason than that it was easily accessed and located more or less immediately offshore from a hotel and pub, which allowed accommodation for the diving volunteers and evening entertainment. He did have genuine archaeological aims as well, in that he was hoping to sort out. Oakbank has a slightly odd shape, and he wanted to sort out what the shape looked like as well. But it is more or less dumb luck that it's a purely early Iron Age site. And that has had a lot of actually sort of follow-on impacts, and it's only through the Living on Water project that uniqueness has really shown through, because the assumption for a long time was that a lot of these other early Iron Age rangefinder dates were substantially similar, and that those sites would only have those early Iron Age phases, but it turns out that's not the case.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for a fascinating lecture again. That was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. As I say, I'm sure you'll join me in a virtual round of applause for Michael there. The next guest lecture in the University of Bradford School of Architectural and Forensic Sciences guest lecture series will be on, let me just consult my calendar, sorry, need to get the correct date. It will be on November the 3rd, Tuesday, November 3rd, which will be Professor Andrew Peterson from the University of Wales, Trinity St David. Do look out for the abstract and title of that coming up shortly on the TMAP site, and do register to attend if you would like to. Hope to see you all on the 3rd of November, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you again, Michael, for giving a fantastic presentation, and I hope you have a lovely rest of the evening and get some food.